Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 219, The King's Great Matter. Today we're going to jump right into it. Last week we covered the issues facing the English Church in the early 16th century, and how Cardinal Wolsey attempted to address some of them with his new legantine powers. But no one, Wolsey included, could have foreseen the massive iceberg on the horizon. Today we press on with our story as Henry confronts the greatest crisis of his reign, the prospect of divorce. The word heresy derives from the Greek haresis, meaning choice. To Orthodox churchmen, heretics were literally people who chose their own opinions over the traditions and teachings of the church. Heresy was virtually as old as Christianity itself. Though to be fair, it was a relative newcomer to England. We can trace heresy in England back to one man, John Wycliffe. Wycliffe, who I did an entire bonus episode about on the Patreon feed, so check that out if you're interested, link in the show notes, lived in the late 15th century. In his day, he was never prosecuted for heresy, thanks to the support he enjoyed from John of Gaunt, Edward III's son. He was, however, declared a heretic posthumously, and his writings banned. Initially, at least, Wycliffe was just another academic debating theology in the hallowed halls of academia. What changed him into a heretic was his refusal to follow the rules of the game. You could debate, but once the church said you were wrong, you had to give in. Wycliffe, seeing the mountains of wealth and corruption surrounding the 15th century church, would not. After Wycliffe's death, heresy hunting in England remains sporadic and dependent on the personalities of individual bishops all the way through the early 16th century. Henry VIII's statement in 1515 that theirs was an English church, plus the European-wide disappointment after the failed Fifth Lateran Council, led to a decline in heresy prosecution. A few bishops, notably Richard Fox of Winchester, led a series of heresy trials between 1513 and 1514, but again, these efforts were sporadic at best. It's important to note that, prior to 1517, that was because there was little to no question that even the Lollards, followers of Wycliffe, were still Catholics. Up until then, all this remained a debate over how to proceed with the reforming of the church. Wycliffe's writings championed a return to an earlier, true church. But for now, the Lollards and everyone else with different opinions found ways to just live within the system that they found, the system that included the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, all this began to change after October 31st, 1517. In March 1518, Thomas More received a parcel of books from his friend Erasmus. One of the books contained, quote, the conclusions on papal pardons, end quote, which Erasmus did not point out expressly, but which were written by Martin Luther. These were none other than a copy of his 95 Theses. But at the time, Luther seemed like a minor player in far-off Germany. He was nothing to be concerned about, while the Ottomans threatened all of Central Europe. The very following year, Erasmus wrote to Melanchthon that he could find nothing in Luther to take offense at. And Luther in England remained a minority interest. He was popular in Germany, but an Oxford bookseller sold only 11 copies of the books by him by 1520. For the first half of the 1520s, the authorities in England believed that Luther's heresy was a distant problem, not something that they really had to worry about. Despite an overt demonstration of support for Luther at Cambridge in 1521, the assumption remained that Luther wasn't an English problem. Still, Wolsey wasn't about to let a weed gain a foothold. On Sunday, May the 12th, 1521, copies of Luther's books were burned outside St. Paul's in London. Wolsey, who showed up to the ceremony 2 hours late, by the by, then broadly excommunicated all of Luther's followers and prepared to get on with more serious business. In 1521, Bishop Fisher called heresy in England, quote, a thick black cloud, end quote, lowering on the distant horizon. No storm had yet broken in England, but that was about to change. In the spring of 1523, a young priest named William Tyndale arrived in London. Tyndale, like many young idealists, was caught up in the ideals of humanism. He believed that there was a way forward for the church. But first, it had to go backward. It needed to be more like the original church of Christ's disciples. It was not long, however, before Tyndale set his sights on an extremely ambitious project. He was going to translate the New Testament into English. In 1524, Tyndale left for Hamburg to begin his work. Not 100% sure what happened to him between then and 1525, but he stayed for a time in Cologne and might have met with Martin Luther. Tyndale completed his Worms edition in early 1526, though it doesn't appear that he got any further than the Gospel according to St. Mark. It was nonetheless a remarkable achievement. Tyndale's New Testament was the first ever translation from the original Greek directly into English. Tyndale's Bible was lively and reflected the kind of English spoken at the time. It was also subversive. His translation struck directly at ecclesiastical authority. The Vulgate used the word prester, from which we get the English priest. But Tyndale wasn't willing to be so authoritative with titles. Instead of the word priest, he used the word for elder. Much more crucially, while the Vulgate continued to address contrition, using the Latin phrase pomenti agiti, which translates to, quote, do penance, Tyndale wrote only repent. In other words, according to Tyndale's Bible, one only had to repent. You didn't need to physically do anything to earn salvation. But the notion of doing penance underpinned so much of the medieval church that when men like Thomas More looked at Tyndale's Bible, they saw nothing less than an assault on the most important institution of the Middle Ages. Tyndale, for his part, called More's criticisms hypocritical. Had not Erasmus, More's friend, used the word elder and repent? More argued this was beside the point. Tyndale was not a heretic because he translated Scripture. He was a heretic because his clear intent was to destroy the Catholic Church and redefine Christianity. Tyndale's New Testament was universally banned by English bishops. It's actually going to come back around later on and be accepted, but they're going to have to change the name. But many of these bishops missed the point. Tyndale's Bible was popular, even amongst themselves who counted themselves as ardent Catholics. A vernacular Bible was a game changer. There was no putting the genie back in the bottle on this one. For his part, Henry wasn't adamantly opposed to it. He was willing to concede the need for a vernacular translation in 1527 and then again in 1530. But he wanted to control it. Again, the major issue facing potential reformers in the early to mid-16th century wasn't whether there was going to be reform. It was who got to do the reforming. Tyndale's Bible led to a similar debate. Who had the right to read and interpret the Bible. Frankly, it's highly unlikely that even an episcopally approved version of an English Bible would have diffused dissent. There were already plenty of those in other parts of Europe, and they were not spared the scarlet H for heresy. But Tyndale and his supporters had the moral high ground. I mean, if you guys are all saying the problem is the translation, then perhaps someone could just go ahead and explain what needed fixing. Tyndale knew that wasn't the problem. It never was. The problem with the translation was that if anyone could read the Bible, then anyone might be able to offer their own interpretation of scriptures. The authorities, Tyndale argued, simply didn't have the guts to let the common people think for themselves. Heresy remained a problem intruding from the outside when, in early 1526, Wolsey decided to act again. With Henry's blessing, he convened 36 English bishops at St. Paul's for another massive burning of Luther's works. Also present were 4 hapless German merchants who had been found reading said works. While they confessed to discussing Luther's ideas and reading his books, they denied having imported anything. Heresy, it seemed, might not be a foreign problem any longer. Indeed, a brotherhood of dissent was already formed in Cambridge. The reality was that, by the mid-1520s, most heretics didn't have a background in Lollardy anymore or look like Lollards. English Catholicism by the 1520s had a humanist flavor, but was not necessarily heretical. Many scholars espousing humanist reform were initiated by Erasmus and his works, not John Wycliffe. Again, the dividing line between heretics and humanists in the 1520s was a very fine one in England. Even at the time of high heresy alert, pulpits remained open to radical, itinerant preachers. In other words, for the most part, you could still debate theology in England by, say, 1526 and keep your head. But the reality was that there was something new going on by 1522. That was the year that Luther published his German New Testament, and the year he added the word allein, or alone, to St. Paul's justification by faith argument. No matter how you sliced it, this was heresy. You could not argue that discarding the medieval requirement for good works was anything less. For many people, salvation by faith alone wasn't just a great slogan. It was a revelation that changed everything. What is interesting, though, is, as you will recall, for Luther, this was all about him and his desire to put himself right with God. That other people latched onto the idea might have struck him as a bit surprising. In the end, there was little that the English authorities could do to prevent the influx of new ideas into the kingdom. It's worth noting that the real birthplace of the English Reformation might have been Antwerp, at the mouth of the River Scheldt, probably 100 miles from the furthest tip of Kent. The connections between Antwerp and England via the cloth trade stretched back hundreds of years. Antwerp was also a center of book production. English authorities might ban the printing of vernacular Bibles in England, but they were powerless to do anything about such production in Antwerp. Authorities in Antwerp did ban the production of heretical Lutheran works, but such prohibitions did not extend to vernacular Bibles in 1526. So between 1528 and 1530, at least 15 different works by English exiles were printed in Antwerp, where they quickly found their way across the Channel. The English ambassador did what he could to prevent this. Technically, there was a treaty of extradition between the Netherlands and England that applied to traitors, but Dutch authorities balked at the suggestion that this applied to alleged heretics. As the English ambassador wrote back to Henry in 1528 about English heretics in Antwerp, quote, "As soon as they be past the seas, they know no more God, neither king." There was never going to be such a thing as a purely English Reformation. The capacity of suspects to flee abroad meant that the nascent reform movement could never be crushed in its infancy. England was an island nation, but an island nation in a period of increasing maritime commerce. London was the main English port, but ships leaving from Newcastle, Hull, Bristol, or Southampton, to name a few, could and did dock at Lutheran ports in Germany. Now, shifting gears for just a moment, in 1524, a series of reform-minded laymen entered London Inns of Court to begin their legal careers. They included men like Simon Fish and John Corbett. These men met a more seasoned attorney, and a man who's going to be central to our story, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell's early life is obscure. The son of a Putney blacksmith, it appears that he went abroad at an early age and spent some time in Italy. For several years after 1510, he was resident in the Low Countries, and he seems to have been closely connected with the London merchant adventurers. By 1520, he had entered Cardinal Wolsey's service as his solicitor, and from that time on, his career is well documented. We'll get back to him soon, but know that by the mid-1520s, Thomas Cromwell was absolutely active in our picture. In March 1529, Henry issued a royal proclamation prohibiting unlicensed preaching and the writing or importation of heretical books. The king was getting serious. But who was he getting serious about? Terms like Protestant didn't exist yet. Determining who was a Lutheran was fraught with difficulty given that Melanchthon had not yet completed his first apology of the faith. Erasmus himself wrote to an English lord in 1521, quote, "A curse on all who rejoice in these factitious labels." The word protestio, which would get translated into Protestant, did not appear in the record first until 1521, when Charles V used it at the Diet of Speyer to rescind recent concessions to Luther's followers. The first Protestants were, frankly, Catholics. I have tendency to use the word evangelical to describe them because that's how some of them, at least, chose to describe themselves. Evangelical comes from the Greek word evangelion, meaning good news, by the way. This language of division eventually reflected the splintering of European Christendom. Germany itself split between North Lutheran and South followers of the Swiss cantons. These divisions themselves were often cited by Catholics as examples as to why evangelicals were the servants of the devil. But the point of all of this was that, in the 1520s, it was impossible to classify English reformers into any one camp. There's little to suggest that early English reformers were Lutherans at all. Most of the trial evidence suggests that they were more sacramentarian than anything else, denying Christ's real presence in the Eucharist. And so enters stage left Anne Boleyn. We introduced her 2 episodes ago, but now it's time to bring her back. Now, Anne was not a Lutheran in any strict sense, but she was certainly reform-minded and returned from France in 1521, stamped with French evangelical reformism. Whether Henry's decision to divorce Catherine was due to an attraction to Anne, or vice versa, we will probably never know. But certainly his growing infatuation with Anne crystallized his doubts in his marriage. I think Henry's actions from this point forward only make sense if we accept that his belief that his marriage was unlawful was 100% genuine. Self-serving? Sure. But he 100% believed that he was being punished by God for a marriage that went against God's law. He would have plenty of chances to fudge and compromise, but Henry never did. No matter whether the Pope or anyone else ever stood against him, he believed to his core that his marriage was invalid, and no one would ever shake him from that belief. The heart of Henry's great matter was the book of Leviticus. Quote, "Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness," end quote. Plus, quote, "And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." Henry there saw his own situation laid bare. Sure, they weren't childless. Lady Mary could attest to that. But Henry did not have a male heir. So from his perspective, that was as good as being childless. Sometimes Henry's confrontation with the Pope is characterized as an act of state. That is totally false. It was a confrontation primed by a fully realized religious conscience. Henry fully believed he had Scripture on his side. He was sure of it. Now he just needed to get the Pope to agree. While Wolsey chewed over the technicalities of a divorce, Henry impatiently sent an envoy to Rome, seeking a dispensation for him to remarry, should his marriage to Catherine be annulled. But here he made a tactical blunder. He also asked for a further dispensation to be allowed to marry Anne Boleyn, despite the fact that he had engaged in sexual intercourse with her sister. Hence, Henry wanted to use Leviticus to annul his marriage to Catherine, while ignoring it so he could marry Anne. In one fell swoop, Henry undercut his entire moral argument. But there was little sense at the time that any of this was going to require Henry to break with papal authority. The plan was just bring enough pressure on Pope Clement VII to pass a favorable sentence, or, ideally, just get Pope Clement to allow Wolsey to do so, since he is the papal legate. While this happened, Henry and Wolsey started kicking the tires a bit to drum up local support. Wolsey discussed the matter with Bishop Fisher, and found him, unfortunately, unconvinced. Luckily for Henry, Robert Wakefield, Cambridge's first official lecturer on Hebrew, wrote in his favor. He argued that the correct translation of Leviticus should not have referred to children, but sons. The jury remains out still today as to whether or not he was right. But Henry was overjoyed. Moreover, all Henry had to do was continue in the Erasmian tradition of critiquing the Vulgate. Henry was right because the Vulgate was wrong. If Clement could see that, then all would be well. If Henry played his cards right, then he could get all of England's humanists on his side. Unfortunately for him, as we will see, English humanism is going to splinter under the pressure of the king's great matter. One English humanist who got a pass, for now, was Thomas More. He was not present when Henry and Wolsey assembled a group of bishops and legal experts at Hampton Court in late 1527 to revise the king's argument to Rome. As we will shortly see, More would not agree with their arguments. Unfortunately, as we know, if Henry's argument hinged on getting a fair trial from Clement, he would be disappointed. Clement's hands were quite literally tied. After the sack of Rome that year, Clement found himself the prisoner of Charles V. Catherine was Charles's aunt. Hence, the emperor was not about to let his pope in his possession rule against his aunt and additionally, potentially push England toward an alliance with France. Clement would act, though. He dispatched yet another papal legate, Lorenzo Campeggio, to sit and judge the matter alongside Wolsey. Now, at this point, both Henry and Wolsey were confident that they had this in the bag. Campeggio was a worldly cardinal, and everybody expected him to be easy to deal with. But he arrived an ill man, and then he decided to postpone the trial, much to Wolsey's chagrin, who recognized Henry's earnest desire to marry Anne. Catherine also did her best to disrupt Henry's plans. She produced the aptly named Spanish Brief, a copy of Julius's dispensation of her marriage to Arthur, but which specifically indicated that her marriage to Arthur had not been consummated. Around the same time, in November 1528, the Spanish ambassador related how, as Henry and Catherine passed from one royal gallery to the next, a large and rapturous crowd began chanting Catherine's name and shouting cries of approval. The people of England loved their queen, and they were not happy with the rumors that Henry intended to set her aside. If Henry wanted to proceed, he would have to do so carefully. Now, it's worth noting, because we're dealing with people here, that Henry had other concerns on his mind in 1528. Up until that point, Henry had enjoyed, generally, good health. But in 1528, that started to change, and he began to be troubled by feverish headaches, rising blood pressure, and a vicious ulcer on his leg. He had very good reasons to be concerned about the state of the succession. Now, there has been a persistent rumor throughout the ages that Henry suffered from syphilis. This is extremely unlikely. It is true that Cardinal Wolsey almost certainly suffered from the disease, but Henry could not have caught it from him, and the symptoms do not line up. So if you want to blame Henry's later decisions on an addled brain, I'm afraid you're out of luck. What I can say for sure is that Henry was a hypochondriac. He considered himself an expert on all manners of disease, and never tired of inventing cures for them. Certainly, that did not help his perspective on his own health. As Cardinal Campeggio neared England, the sweating sickness broke out again. This prompted Henry to move away from London, and ordered that his illegitimate son be removed as a precaution. He was right to react the way he did. The outbreak was especially vicious. 40,000 cases were diagnosed in London alone. Anne and her father both caught the sweating sickness. Henry sent his second surgeon to tend to them. Around the same time, fearing that the plague might be an indication of divine displeasure, Henry kept his queen with him and followed a strict devotional routine. What began as a flight from the plague turned into a progress, and the king was careful to visit any local shrines he came across for the health of his soul. The great matter polarized opinion amongst the elite, leading to a vicious struggle for power. By 1528, there were three distinct factions at court. First were Wolsey and his followers. Then there were the aristocratic conservatives centered around the Nevilles. Finally, there was the Boleyn faction. Both groups 2 and 3 wanted Wolsey out of power. Joining this larger faction were the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk. They didn't like Anne, but saw her as their best chance to get rid of Wolsey. Catherine, for her part, enjoyed the unwavering support of several churchmen, Bishops Fisher and Fox, namely. Even by 1528, there is no doubt that Cardinal Wolsey's influence was waning. One courtier reported in August of that year that Wolsey was, quote, no longer received at court as graciously as before. As his grasp on power weakened, the coalition forming around him continued to plot his downfall. Wolsey was stuck in an impossible position. Anne's elevation meant his destruction, and he knew that. But that was what Henry wanted, and he needed to do his master's bidding. So Wolsey swallowed hard and worked to get Henry the annulment he needed while plying Anne with gifts. The two were always cordial to one another, but that fooled no one. In the meantime, the king had been reading as many experts on canon and civil law as he could get his hands on, still expecting his case to go before the two legates soon. And that begs the question, just what was Cardinal Campeggio up to? Of course, Clement had given his new legate specific instructions. He wasn't leaving this up to the cardinal to just kind of wing it. Campeggio was told he needed to reconcile the king and queen, or if he could not, convince Catherine to enter a nunnery. Henry would not reconcile, and Catherine would do nothing but assert that she was Henry's lawful wife. Hence, plans A and B failed before they even got off the ground. Campeggio could do nothing but write back to Rome in vain. He complained that Henry, quote, sees nothing. He thinks of nothing but Anne. He cannot do without her for an hour. He did have some good news for the Pope. Anne was playing hard to get. The two had not consummated anything yet. Henry did not help the matter by moving Anne into his residency at Durham. But Anne and her faction were never well liked, either by the people in general or at court. At court, they were seen as grasping social climbers. Out in public, the people jeered at her. Once, when Henry and Anne were seen together riding, one of his more audacious subjects shouted, "Back to your wife." In November, the king and queen were together at one of the royal residencies, and a large group gathered outside to demonstrate in favor of Catherine. Without other options, Henry went out and he spoke to them. He told them that these proceedings were all formalities, and if Pope Clement determined that his marriage was lawful, then he would just return to his wife without issue. No one reported whether his nose visibly grew as he said that. But then in early December, Henry took advantage of the Queen's absence and moved Anne into his own house at Greenwich. That led to I'll just say, tense Christmas. Anne kept to her own apartments, while in the official chamber the court conducted the usual revelries. Catherine presided over the main festivities during the early months of 1529, while preparations for trial moved forward. Henry wanted Archbishop Warham to serve as Catherine's legal counsel for the proceedings, but she had little faith in the man who was clearly Henry's servant. Instead, she picked the aging but very principled John Fisher. At this point, Wolsey, who had left no stone unturned, was absolutely confident of victory. On May the 31st, 1529, the trial of the king's great matter began in the Great Hall of Blackfriars in London. There was immense public interest in the trial. Of course, the Queen had her supporters, but never before had a king and queen sat in trial in England. It was due to be quite the spectacle. It almost never happened. When she entered the courtroom, Catherine did not go to her appointed chair. Instead, she went straight for Henry. Falling on her knees before him, she begged him to take her back, swearing she had been a virgin when they wed, quote, without touch of man. She finished by telling him that if he insisted on moving forward, she would simply have to put her faith in God. Henry didn't move a muscle. While he stared straight ahead, Catherine gathered herself and left the great hall to the throngs of cheering Englishmen outside. Wolsey and Campeggio declared her present for the purposes of the trial and began proceedings. There followed day after day of depositions and heated discussions, most of which focused on whether or not Catherine had consummated her marriage with Arthur. Most of the evidence was in Henry's favor. Bishop Fisher was the lone voice of dissent. telling the court, quote, "This marriage of the king and queen can be dissolved by no power, human or divine." Henry rejected this complaint as the, quote, view of but one man. Finally, the trial ended on July the 31st, 1529. Then, Cardinal Campeggio shocked the courtroom. He stood and abruptly declared he was pausing the proceedings and returning to Rome. In reality, he was only following the secret instructions Clement had given him. But the mood in the Great Hall was apoplectic. Suffolk shouted in anger. Henry was appalled. Wolsey stood shocked. It was the end for him, and he probably knew it. In retrospect, this was a watershed moment in English and Western history. Henry had done his best to play by the rules. But if the Pope was not going to play ball, then Henry would just have to change them. On August the 9th, 1529, Henry sent out writs for a parliament. It was the first in 6 years. Some contemporaries believed that Henry had now determined to settle his great matter using secular authority. But that isn't likely, at least not yet. What is more likely is that Henry intended to use Parliament to ratchet up pressure on Pope Clement. But if Henry was still willing to work with the Pope, Wolsey's time was all but over. His divorce strategy was in tatters, and now his enemies, of which he had many, began to circle. Quote, "Every man of the king's council began to lay to him such offenses as they knew by him." Prior to this, even before the end of the trial, the House of Lords considered a proposal, quote, "that never legate nor cardinal be in England." It was pretty clear who the target of that proposal was. The imperial ambassador Chapuis believed that Parliament was convening for the express purpose of outlawing legates in England. But Wolsey's fall turned out to be not that immediate. Amazingly, after the failure of the divorce strategy, Wolsey came to court and Henry received him warmly, raising him to his feet even after he fell to his knees begging for forgiveness. Anne was furious. She wanted Wolsey gone. The following morning, she contrived to take the king hunting early so that Wolsey would need to depart without seeing his majesty. Henry never saw the cardinal again. Even after the Blackfriars debacle, it's likely that Henry would have stuck with him were that failure not immediately compounded by disasters in the realm of foreign policy. Word reached Henry that France and the Empire were moving toward their own alliance, leaving England out in the cold. Okay, now Henry reasoned, Wolsey had to go. By autumn, everyone expected Wolsey's head to roll, but Henry chose a different path. He accused the cardinal of primanery, depriving the crown of lawful income or authority. Specifically, Cardinal Wolsey had violated this law when he became legate, because that superseded some of Henry's lawful authority. Never mind that Henry himself had pushed for Wolsey's legatine powers. In the end, Wolsey was charged with 44 counts of primanery. On October the 30th, he was found guilty, and all his goods and possessions declared forfeit. He was allowed to retain several of his ecclesiastical holdings, including York. Wolsey's largest houses, York Palace and Hampton Court, were now Henry's possessions. Wolsey's coat of arms were torn down and replaced. Wolsey took the decision with the grace he could muster. He decided for the first time to travel to the archdiocese he'd technically held since 1514, York. Meanwhile, one of Wolsey's former protégés, Thomas Cromwell, who we mentioned before, thought this was his moment. He left Wolsey and determined he would run for Parliament, winning a seat just before the newest Parliament convened on November the 3rd, 1529. Parliament opened with the usual song and dance about how perfect King Henry had been led astray by a wicked advisor. Wolsey was not named, but everybody could connect the dots pretty easily. Wolsey's fall was crucial for the future of Henry's court. Never again would a churchman dominate the way the cardinal had. From this point on, the Privy Council was completely controlled by the nobility. The times, they were a-changin'. Henry would rule England essentially alone for the next 2 years, and he quickly found the business of running a kingdom tiring. He told Anne that Wolsey had left the country such a mess, it would take years to sort it out. But the truth was obvious. Wolsey had shouldered a lot of the responsibilities that Henry did not understand and did not want to understand. At the end of one particularly frustrating day, Henry yelled at his new counselors that Wolsey had been, quote, a better man than any of them for managing matters, before he stomped out. Wolsey's replacement as Lord Chancellor of England was a bit surprising, to say the least. Sir Thomas More. More was an outspoken opponent of the ongoing divorce, so it speaks volumes as to Henry's respect for the man that he would be appointed to lead Henry's government. Now, More was actually the compromise candidate. Everyone wanted someone untainted by Wolsey's fall from grace, and More seemed like the perfect man. Thomas More did not want the position, but acquiesced to a royal command. Plus, there was a rising tide of heresy abroad. As Chancellor, More reasoned that he might be in a perfect position to attack it. Norfolk and Suffolk were named joint presidents of the Privy Council in Wolsey's absence, and Stephen Gardiner was named his new personal secretary. At about 32 years old, Gardiner had been Wolsey's secretary for years. Technically a religious conservative, Gardiner was nonetheless absolutely unshakable in his belief that Henry was the true head of the Church of England. In the end, I think Gardiner probably understood Henry better than anyone, perhaps even better than Wolsey. Henry valued him more than anyone else. He once said that when Gardiner went away, it was as though someone had taken away his right hand. The Parliament that sat between November and December 1529 had business of various kinds to conduct, but it would only be remembered as, quote, a Parliament for the enormities of the clergy. It has also been called the Reformation Parliament. I kind of imagine the beginning of this session of Parliament like that scene from the movie Miracle on 34th Street, when all those guys walk in with sacks of mail for Santa Claus. But in this case, all those sacks are full of written grievances of every kind imaginable about the clergy and the monastic houses. But despite all the outpouring of complaints, the actual legislative actions of this Parliament were modest. Pluralism got hit hard. Parliament passed a rule against holding more than one benefice, worth £8 a year or more. It also wrote that priests had to be in residency in their diocese for at least 10 months out of the year. Wolsey was a lightning rod for this and more action. But working behind the scenes, Thomas Cromwell prevented any further action against his former master, at least for now. It's hard to remember, but important nonetheless to keep in mind that Henry's desire for a divorce and the evangelical desire for reform were totally separate matters, connected only by a coincidence in time. There is no reason why their paths should have crossed. But they did. And once they did, the English Reformation became an act of state. In England, the spiritual and political Reformation were never distant cousins. But in the word of one historian, they were conjoined twins. Already back in Easter, Cardinal Campeggio had found, quote, certain Lutheran books in English, of an evil sort, in the king's court. Good Catholic or not, Henry's religious views became increasingly aggressive throughout 1529. During one dinner, he belabored Chapuis about various clerical and papal abuses. If Luther had simply gone after the clergy and left the sacraments alone, Henry probably would have written for him. On November 30th, as he dined with Catherine, Henry bluntly informed her that, if the Pope continued to ignore the well-founded theological arguments that they were not husband and wife, he would denounce the Pope as a heretic and marry whom he pleased. While evangelicals saw some reason for optimism, a 1530 proclamation pledging a future vernacular Bible, for example, they would continue to be frustrated throughout Henry's life. Henry was no evangelical, nor would he be. But he was tired of the Pope. When a churchman was brought up on heresy charges, Henry noticed that one of the charges was denying that the Pope was the head of the church. Henry demanded that that be struck, because he said the man was right. While Henry was wringing his hands, his ministers, Fox and Gardiner, happened on a lucky break. It just so happened that in August, the two men were staying overnight with some local gentry. Another guest, who also happened to be present, was a young refugee running from an outbreak of plague at Cambridge, Thomas Cranmer. The dinner conversation turned to Henry's great matter, and Cranmer was not shy about telling the men that they were going about it all wrong. There wasn't even reason to bother with the Pope. They just needed to canvass the experts, the theologians. Henry's men should question the various universities and see what they thought. Cranmer was confident that they would come down on Henry's side. Gardiner told Henry about the idea, and he positively loved it. Within a matter of weeks, Anne Boleyn had appointed Cranmer as his chaplain. It was the beginning of a formidable political and religious relationship. Cranmer would long be one of Henry's staunchest supporters. Fox and Gardiner immediately began the process of sussing out theological opinions. Cambridge and Oxford offered only lukewarm support. But the biggest fish was the University of Paris, with its prestigious theological faculty. After several massive bribes, and with Francis I leaning heavily on them, Paris returned a verdict in Henry's favor in July 1530. Other French universities, Orléans, Toulouse, and Bruges, followed suit thereafter. The Italian universities were less helpful. It was, overall, hardly more than a lukewarm endorsement, but it was enough to right the ship and give Henry and his supporters justification to continue their course of action. On June 12, 1530, Henry summoned all the leading nobles and office holders to a giant petition meeting. This is something that hadn't been done for centuries. Essentially, the great magnates of the realm all signed a petition demanding that the Pope change his opinion on the question of the annulment based on, quote, the opinion of the most famous universities and most learned men in Christendom. 44 of the most powerful nobles and 22 heads of religious houses signed the petition, which ended with the ominous line that if the Pope did not see reason, then the English people would, quote, seek our remedy elsewhere. For Henry, the matter was over. He wrote to Clement telling him as much. It wasn't a split with Rome, but England was now right up against the edge. Henry, though, still had some convincing to do. Catherine remained popular with his subjects. He had to take his case to them. So Parliament had the opinions of the universities published, along with a lengthy treatise explaining the need for Henry to annul his marriage. Ironically, the task to see that all this happened fell to Lord Chancellor Thomas More, who did as he was told. By now, Anne's hand-highedness was starting to offend some of those who had previously been sympathetic to her. Moreover, many people were concerned about her religious sympathies. She and her family were known to favor church reform and an evangelical approach to religion. On several occasions, she had used her influence to save heretics from persecution. Still, Anne was nevertheless orthodox in her observance of the faith. No one ever accused her of heresy. It seems that she genuinely liked the images and ritual of the Catholic Church. But she differed from many of her contemporaries, believing that the Bible should be read in the vernacular. By early December 1529, the Boleyn faction was supreme. Her father had been named to several earldoms previously held by the Staffords. But Henry's illegitimate son was now 10 years old, and he remained the first option if something unexpected should befall the king. None of Anne's schemes or plans would come to anything if she did not eventually bear him a son, though she had to get the crown first. By 1530, Thomas Cromwell's star was really starting to rise in Henry's court. Cromwell had a genius for administration and finance, and this is what initially endeared him to the king. He was pragmatic, knowledgeable, hard-headed, and often ruthless. Like Wolsey, he was a hard-working businessman with a talent for management. Unlike Wolsey, he was not a churchman. Henry was the only man he would ever serve, and the only one he ever wanted to serve. Although not university educated, Cromwell spoke Latin, French, Italian, and some Greek. The Boleyn faction wasted no time in scooping him up and positioning him to serve their interests. As for the king, he was confident this new advisor would be able to expedite his great matter. Around this time, Henry himself also started to change. His mood grew darker. He became distrustful of everyone. Erasmus himself noted how much he had begun to resemble his father. The young, idealistic humanist was giving way to a selfish, dogmatic tyrant. Much of this had to do with the stress of running his kingdom, coupled with the declining health and the weight of his great matter. All the while, Henry dwelled on the simple fact that he did not have a male heir. The clock was ticking. As he grew older, Henry also became more sentimental and secretive. He built more palace privy lodgings for himself in all his major noble houses, notably at Hampton Court and Greenwich, the two places he spent most of his time. These changes around 1530 resulted in some of Henry's houses falling out of use. Desperate for newer properties that would meet all of his needs and reflect the magnificence of his office, Henry embarked on a building spree that would last the rest of his reign. Prior to 1530, Wolsey handled most of these projects. After 1530, Henry would conduct his affairs on his own. He was so eager to see his projects completed, he spent a fortune on overtime fees for builders. And he wasn't the only one who paid. Several builders died as a result of rushed timetables and a disregard for safety. The building budget slowly replaced the entertainment budget at Henry's court. If you visited Henry's court in 1510 and then again in 1530, you would find a much more somber atmosphere. Henry's court after 1530 was also much less open. The great matter had led to a split amongst English humanists. The older generation, men like Thomas More and Fisher, supported the Queen. The younger generation, men like Cromwell and Cranmer, supported the king. At court and within English universities, the idea of humanism had now become tied to the idea of reform. As a result, depending on the day, and I do mean that, Henry might censor this or that author depending on his tastes. In an example of how unpredictable Henry was becoming, he invited his cousin, Reginald Pole, to come to England from Italy and take up the Archbishopric of York in the hope that he would support the divorce. Pole, who was sympathetic to the Queen, ultimately declined. During the private meeting, in which Henry was told, the king nearly punched his cousin in the face. Things were getting really heated. Even the Duke of Suffolk fell out with the king during this period as a result of his unpredictable mood swings. The summer of 1530 brought plague, forcing Henry from Hampton Court to Greenwich. The king spent nearly the entire month of August hunting and trying to stay away from any living humans. His illegitimate son was sent back to Windsor as a precaution. Now, while all this had been going on, Cardinal Wolsey was living his ecclesiastical life in York, trying not to bother anybody. Suddenly, and almost certainly after pressure from the Boleyn faction, in November 1530, the old cardinal was arrested for high treason. Wolsey traveled south, knowing that his final destination was the chopping block. But he was also a very sick man, suffering from advanced syphilis, amongst other ailments. When he arrived at Leicester Abbey, about 25 miles due south of Nottingham, he collapsed. As he lay dying, Wolsey said, quote, "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my gray hairs." He died on November 29th, 1530. According to our sources, Henry was grieved to hear about his death. The cardinal had served him well in life. But Wolsey's death could not turn back time. In December 1530, spurred on by Cromwell and the rampant anti-clericalism brought on by the Great Matter, Henry indicted 15 senior clergymen for praemunire. This time their offense was recognizing Wolsey's legatine authority. You know, that authority that Henry worked so hard to get for him? Luckily for Henry, hypocrisy was evidently not against the law in Tudor England. And that is where I want to leave it for this episode. The Great Matter has now brought down the second most powerful man in the realm and torn the kingdom asunder. England stands at the very precipice of reformation and separation from Rome. Anne Boleyn, Cranmer, and Cromwell now push the king to attempt ever more aggressive policies. Next time, Henry dispenses with all the formalities and declares himself the head of the Church of England. As always, if you're interested in more content, check out the website at westerncivpodcast.com, or for a free trial of Western Civ 2.0, check out the link in the show notes, glow.fm/Western Civ.